Vampire stories are derivative. The earliest recorded stories from the very late 17th and early 18th centuries didn't emerge out of a vacuum. They were built upon the foundations of earlier lore, stitched together from diverse cultural traditions and narratives and fears of the dead returning to prey upon the living. The earliest vampire literature of the very late 18th and early 19th centuries, borrowing themes from those earlier documented instances of vampire hysteria, were likewise built upon already established cultural traditions and narratives of the supernatural. In turn, the vampire stories of fiction and literature have time and again inspired vampire-like murders, crimes, and fetishes, and these have, of course, inspired their own stories. By the early 20th century, the well-known vampire of popular culture would have been unrecognizable by his earliest documented counterpart. There's little, in fact, to connect Arnold Powell to Christopher Lee, and yet to their contemporaries, each clearly represented the commonly recognized vampire tropes of their time. So much had been borrowed and discarded and altered and shifted in the evolution of the vampire between those 2 points, and yet the story of the vampire continued to carry the power to frighten. Perhaps the earliest proto-vampire stories began as blood cults established before the Common Era. Or maybe the emergence of vampire plagues and epidemics of the 17th and 18th century Eastern Europe began centuries before, with the introduction of Christianity into the region and the conflict between pre-Christian practices of cremation and church-sanctioned practice of burying the dead. But the stories that continued being passed down across the generations were shaped by conflict and strife and death and contagion, fear of the unknown, and fear of the devil and his demonic minions. In fiction, the earliest vampire stories built fear and disquiet out of uneasy intimacy between decent, upstanding protagonists and mysterious, sinister strangers. The vampire was no longer the once familiar made unfamiliar through death and unholy resurrection. The novelist, poets, and playwrights of the Romantic era imagined the vampire as having always been the unfamiliar outsider. And yet, the vampire of the 19th century was as utterly dependent on earlier records of vampire hysteria as the 21st century vampire is dependent on the vampires of the Regency and Victorian eras. They are linked. The vampire as the outsider certainly isn't new. Vampires who try to shun eating people until if and when their hunger becomes undeniable is nothing new. Vampire stories with biblical themes is nothing new. Vampires burning or not burning in the sun is nothing new. I can think of multiple vampire stories that claim to trace the lineage of vampires back to the biblical Cain, the first murderer. So there's nothing new about the 2015 film He Never Died, where, spoiler alert, Henry Rollins plays a vampire who claims to be Cain, except for the part where this film might not even be a vampire story at all. I can explain, I promise. I'm Rose Sinister, and I love vampire stories so much, I made them my life's work. Between this podcast and my regular night job as a vampire tour guide in New Orleans' historic French Quarter, suffice to say I've had a lot of time and opportunities to ponder the undead. Why do we tell vampire stories? As I ask tourists on my vampire tours and listeners on this podcast, I think the answer has a lot to tell us. About us. Henry Rollins is a force of nature. Formerly the punk rock vocalist for Black Flag, hyper-prolific writer, publisher, actor, public speaker, comedian, podcaster, and energetic world traveler, he's about as far removed from the homebound, lethargic, taciturn Jack, whom he plays in the film He Never Died, as one could possibly get. And yet, watching the film, it's also impossible to imagine anyone else playing the role, a part which was actually written with him in mind, and it shows, clearly, in the finished film. What results from Rollins' collaboration with writer-director Jason Krasik is a vampire movie that might not actually be a vampire movie. The project was pitched to potential investors as the Henry Rollins Eats People project, and the joke about vampires being cannibals on a juice diet quickly loses steam if the vampire is actually a cannibal. Without fangs, high-performance superpowers, or even extreme daylight combustibility, Jack lacks many of the definitive characteristics that have come to define vampire stories in the 21st century. And yet, He Never Died builds so seamlessly upon so many of the themes explored in so many of the vampire stories that precede it, it's hard to define the film as anything other than a vampire movie. Addiction to blood, of course, has long been a thematic staple in vampire stories. Movies like 1983's The Hunger and 2008's Thirst explore this more or less directly, while Only Lovers Left Alive offers perhaps a more opaque opium-chic analogy. He Never Died adds an interesting dimension to this perspective, seeing Jack purchasing hospital blood from a debt-riddled medical intern, which serves to offset the worst of his cravings for human flesh. In much the same manner methadone is used to treat heroin addiction. Jack's predictable schedule, leaving his apartment only to eat bland vegetarian food at the local diner and playing bingo at a local church hall, surrounded by geriatric old people whose stringy flesh doesn't interest him much, speaks volumes about the ways in which a person in recovery has to create new patterns and systems in their life that break up their old, destructive habits. The ennui of centuries is another theme explored throughout vampire stories. Louis de Pontelac of Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire comes to mind as perhaps the classic example of this, but Jack certainly plays the same chronically depressed condition, manifesting very differently. And that alone is important because depression has many faces. And even in our monster stories, depicting mental illness manifesting in diverse ways does help reduce the stigma surrounding mental health and illness. Other elements of He Never Died are very much present in other stories. The urban setting, mob boss menace, and coffee shop backdrop of the film also call to mind an earlier cult vampire film, the quirky Canadian Blood and Donuts from 1995. There's even a similarity in the plot point both films share about an old mortal lover coming back into the picture to complicate matters for the undying protagonist. That film, too, treated vampirism more as an addiction that the vampire character was desperate to be ultimately free from. The similarities to other vampire stories doesn't end there. White Wolf's classic Monsters We Are, Lest Monsters We Become role-playing game, Vampire the Masquerade, has also long presented the vampire's need for blood, or vitae in the game mechanics, as a type of unholy, inescapable addiction that makes the vampire characters players of the game explore truly damned. And that, of course, is not the only major commonality between the mythologies of He Never Died and Vampire the Masquerade. More on that in a moment. Addiction and its destructive consequences, the challenges of sobriety, avoiding socialization with people to avoid the urge to harm or kill them, haunted by centuries of violent memories, struggling to keep up with changing languages and customs at time, and grappling with existential ennui are all recurrent themes throughout the movie, punctuated by a persistent droning background noise of centuries past. Jack doesn't even know how old he is anymore. He's lost track. War and atrocity after war and atrocity seamlessly blending together into a steady buzz that never fully abates throughout the film. Jack sleepwalks through modern life, towing the line, sleeping the day away to keep his demons at bay. And because, perhaps, sleep is the closest thing to death Jack can attain. Human blood is a poor substitute for the satisfying crunch of snacking down on human fingers or the wet, spongy texture of internal organs, but it dulls the hunger. It takes the edge off. But Jack's boring life is interrupted by an unwelcome phone call from a former lover and the realization that he has a grown daughter, a young woman with a lip ring named Andrea, who, to absolutely no one's surprise, turns out to have substance abuse demons of her own. Sure, dependency on alcohol and Adderall isn't the same as an unslakable need to consume human flesh and blood, but putting aside the extreme differences their addictions take shape as, all I'm saying is that sometimes the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and forbidden fruit can take many forms. This isn't a story with a heartwarming resolution extolling the value of family and human relationships. Jack is a monster who struggles with his desire to eat people, and his daughter is not shielded from that hunger, as Jack visibly struggles to rein in his baser instincts more than once around her. The film doesn't take the easy way out with trite sentiment. It is unapologetic in showing not only the strain Jack endures as his routine is interrupted, but the awful emotional toll his addiction, his unnatural hunger takes on those who would care about him. Jack lashes out at his daughter with painfully intense cruelty in one particular scene that just might break the heart of anyone who's ever loved an addict. When Andrea is kidnapped, Jack's motivation to rescue her from the hired thugs who torture her is less about his role as reluctant father and more about his quest for answers, as a series of seemingly unrelated incidents and individuals converge on a finale that does not provide Jack with the resolution he so desperately seeks. There's a recurring visual throughout the film of a silent man in a wide-brimmed black hat who only Jack, and also, we discover, Andrea can see. If ever there was a doubt in Jack's mind as to whether or not Andrea was of his lineage, it's the moment when he realizes that the young woman with a lip ring can see the man in black as well that shatters all doubt. The mere presence of the man in black, arriving in Jack's life at this exact point of strained sobriety, haunts Jack with the tantalizing possibility of final death. And Jack's life has been dominated by death, and all the deaths he's been the direct cause of, and all the people dying around him. He's bored and depressed and surrounded by reminders that he's never going to die, and the man in black, with the big black hat, plays a role in all of that. Now hang on. Before I get on with the rest of the episode, a small but very important announcement. The Rose Sinister Vampires podcast now has an official sponsor. I'm pleased to announce that I have formally teamed up with Endless Night Productions, welcoming the vampire world and keeping Endless Night culture alive through podcasts, live events, and more. Go to endlessnight.com for information about upcoming events, projects, and products. Sponsorships like these are profoundly important to small projects like mine, so I hope you'll check out all that Endless Night has to offer. We now return to the rest of our podcast. Jack doesn't die. He's never died. He's been around since the Bible, after all. He finally reveals himself to be Cain, or Cain, as it was originally pronounced before becoming the anglicized version most familiar to most Americans today. But if Cain is the first murderer, does that make the man in black God? In the Abrahamic religious traditions, the biblical story of Genesis contains accounts of the creation of the world and the first people, humanity's fall from grace and expulsion from the Garden of Eden, and the awful tragedy which befell the offspring of the first man and the first woman. In the last episode, I talked a bit about the Sumerian Lulitu demons, which likely inspired the Jewish accounts of Lilith, Adam's first wife, a narrative purposefully and deliberately excised from Christian scripture. In the hands of storytellers, ancient and modern, Lilith has become a sort of proto-vampiric figure herself, inspiring narratives of blood-drinking and child-killing for millennia. But Lilith is not the only early human of ancient mythology to have inspired vampire stories. The firstborn son of Lilith's successor, Adam's second wife, Eve or Chava, has also inspired more than a few vampire stories. Perhaps the most well-known example of this from the last few decades is the vampiric creation mythos at the heart of White Wolf Games' Vampire the Masquerade role-playing game, where Cain is not only a vampire, but the progenitor of all subsequent vampires to have ever roamed the earth. Jack's not like that, though. He's a vampire, maybe, but he's the only one. So let's talk about Cain and Abel, or Cain and Abel, homicide and blood and demons and religion and folklore and fiction here. But I've got a few things to say before diving in. 1. I'll be using the term Abrahamic religious traditions here instead of what might be a more commonly used term Judeo-Christian, and really briefly, I want to talk about why that choice of word matters. The first issue is that simply language matters, and Judeo-Christian implies a cultural and theological homogeneity that does not, in fact, exist between Christianity and Judaism. The second issue is that Judeo-Christian erases other religious traditions which view the biblical figure of Abraham as the father of their faith, most notably Islam. And since I'm already going there, I should probably point out that culturally and theologically, Judaism has more in common with Islam than Christianity anyway. That whole idea of God incarnate in the form of Jesus Christ is actually not only utterly absent, but theologically antithetical to both Islam and Judaism. Just saying. In America, Christians are likely to use Judeo-Christian when describing values and beliefs that are solidly rooted in North American Protestantism for basically the same reason that the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. was designed in a neoclassical style, to lend the illusion of antiquity, and therefore authority, to what is otherwise new. Food for thought. But the point is, we do the same thing today with vampire stories, frequently circling back to old stories or folklore to create a sense of timelessness or an unbroken chain, where none actually exist as far as the greater body of folklore is concerned. It's human nature to cherry-pick from history, folklore, and scripture alike. I'm just saying we should be more honest about it. I'd also like to thank Rabbi Uriarte, a rabbinical student living in and serving a community in Billings, Montana, for his assistance in helping me navigate a Jewish perspective for my work here. Eric and I met at a vampire LARP in Los Angeles a million years ago, so he's as aware of Jewish scripture as he is of the idea of Cain as a vampiric figure. Any mistakes made in this next part are mine, and mine alone. We don't know for sure when the first stories of Cain and Abel or Cain and Abel were first recorded, but it fits a general narrative pattern of rival brothers throughout Near East literature. It may also be a reworking of an archetypical story from the region about the rivalry between pastoralists, specifically the semi-nomadic type, and agriculturalists that stayed in one place, which is why Cain went on to found what was said to be the first city, Nod. I'm not going to make a big deal about how that's essentially the central conflict of the classic musical Oklahoma, but if you've got a certain song stuck in your head now, you're welcome. The ancient story tells of Cain and Abel, brothers born of Adam and Eve, or Chava. Minor Midrash, or Jewish interpretations of scripture over the centuries, have inferred that Cain was conceived out of intercourse between Eve and the serpent, which may or may not have been the angel Samael. And I'm only bringing this up here because it relates to the part of He Never Died when Jack confesses that he doesn't know if he was ever human to begin with, and a brief glance of his back in an early scene in the film where he appears to have two parallel scars on his back, reminiscent of a place where typical wings may once have been. As tempting as this might be to those inclined to write Good Omens He Never Died fanfic, also, as an aside, please write me that fanfic, it's important to remember that this interpretation is in stark contrast to the vast majority of Jewish, Christian, and Islamic teaching on the paternity of Cain, which stresses that he was the human child of Adam and Chava. Cain was a farmer who presented an offering to God some of his harvest. Abel was a shepherd or pastoralist who presented one of his flock as an offering as well. God preferred Abel's offering over Cain's. Cain got upset, and he struck his brother down. The first murder in the Abrahamic religious traditions. Did Cain even know what murder was when he struck his brother? What exactly was wrong with his offering of grain or flaxseed? What exactly was the sin that Cain was punished for? Religious scholars have debated for centuries across religious disciplines, and quite frankly, this episode could go on indefinitely if I addressed every nuance, but the gist of the narrative was this. And it came to pass, when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him. And the Lord said unto Cain, Where is Abel thy brother? And he said, I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? And he said, What hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. And now thou art cursed from the earth, which hath opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand. That's Genesis 4, 8 through 11 from the King James Version of the Christian Bible published in 1611, which might not be the best translation, but it certainly is the most goth, so I'm sticking with it. Now, according to Rabbi Uriarte, Cain deliberately gave an offering of something he didn't need and didn't care about anyway, got mad about it, blamed his brother. God stepped in and gave him explicit instructions as to what he did wrong and how to fix it. Cain refused to listen and took out his anger on his brother, and then, when confronted about it to offer a chance at atonement, lied about it out of a sense of hubris that he could conceal the truth from God. Only that last part was the true sin of Cain, because it represented a complete refusal to take responsibility for an action that could not be undone. Everything before that allowed a chance for atonement. Atonement, however, isn't a theme that gets much attention in He Never Died. But this is the place where traditional biblical scholarship and interpretation of a religious nature and creative license diverge. In the Abrahamic tradition, Cain or Cain is marked by God so none will kill him as he killed Abel or Havel. Cain goes off to found the city of Nod, and many years later is killed when a house built by one of his descendants crashes down on him. But in certain vampire stories, this is where things get interesting. And for shedding the blood of Havel, Cain is marked by a curse of bloodlust, transformed into a monster not unlike Lilith was, and then he never died. I enjoyed this fascinating detour into biblical exegesis because I think it offers a lot of depth toward understanding Jack's character in He Never Died. To have been around since, theoretically, before the rise and fall of the first city-states, one has to imagine the sheer brutal weight of the ennui of millennia weighing down on his psyche. And that alone offers context and nuance for his initial reluctance and hesitance to rescue his daughter Andrea the moment Jack realizes that she's been kidnapped. At one point, when asked where Andrea was, knowing full well that Andrea's mother, Jack's ex-lover Jillian, has already been killed by the same mobsters who hold Andrea hostage. Jack isn't motivated by the pain and suffering of mortals, innocent or otherwise. He's not necessarily seeking to cause harm at this juncture in his life, but he feels no moral compunction to prevent harm or offer comfort either. And he's certainly, by his own admission, gone out of his way at times to cause as much pain and suffering as inhumanly possible, confessing to the audience via the man in the wide-brimmed black hat towards the end that he killed thousands in Wallachia. If Jack is Dracula, he's a very different kind of Vlad Tepes than we last saw in Elizabeth Kostova's The Historian. And ultimately, that's the enduring beauty of vampire stories. They may be derivative as all hell, but the way they circle back around to connect to each other, to folklore, to history, to religion, and the enduring human experience is part of what makes the vampire so hard to kill. As Nick Groom writes in his remarkable book, The Vampire, A New History, vampires are not to be confined within the comparatively limited categories of myth, science, and culture, but should instead combine many fields of human inquiry within a single weird being that can challenge us today as powerfully as it has done for nearly 3 centuries. Vampires are good to think with. He Never Died is an unusual film, set so far apart that some might argue that it isn't even really a vampire film to begin with, and yet it is also, unquestionably, quintessentially, a vampire film. Vampires may or may not have reflections, but their stories do. Thanks for listening. This episode has been written and recorded since February 3rd, but languished unedited on my laptop as I traveled to New York and then Los Angeles, performed vampire tours in the French Quarter all through Mardi Gras, and, to the surprise of absolutely no one, came down with a nasty case of COVID-19, which wasn't fun. Most of March and April was spent either sick or recuperating, physically and emotionally, from everything that's happened in the world since I first recorded this episode. But I'm putting the finishing touches on this project on Walpurgis Night of all nights, and if ever there was a time to work through the night and make sure an episode about vampires gets published, it's this one, which should go live early in the morning hours of Beltane, U.S. Central Time. I am beyond grateful to my incredible Patreon supporters, including my top-tier producers Destiny Maddox and the Scarlet Dahlia, and Endless Night Productions, who are now an official sponsor of the Rose Sinister Vampires podcast. Next time, I'm going to be exploring the unique and indie graphic novel Life Sucks, which offers an interesting inversion of some of the most beloved tropes of recent vampire stories. It is an interesting and tantalizingly grounded take on the modern vampire legend, so I hope you'll join me as Rose Sinister Vampires presents Life Sucks by Jessica Abel, Gabe Soria, and Warren Pleece.